Here's a question worth sitting with before anything else in this video, because the honest answer will likely surprise you more than you'd expect. What happens when the country that has controlled a river for 100 years actually contributes almost none of that river's water? And the country that genuinely creates that water deep in its own highlands finally decides, after a century of exclusion, to build a switch entirely of its own. Picture a wheat field in Egypt, brilliantly green and carefully irrigated, surrounded on every side by desert, fed entirely by a river that, at this exact moment somewhere far away, is falling as fresh monsoon rain more than 3,000 kilometers away. On a mountainside, in a completely different country, most Egyptian farmers have never visited and likely never will. For most of the last century, Egypt has been called, and has proudly called itself, the gift of the Nile. Egyptian civilization, Egyptian agriculture, Egyptian daily survival itself, all of it built, quite literally, on the assumption that this single river belongs to Egypt in every practical and legal sense that has ever actually mattered. Here's the detail. Almost nobody living outside this specific region of the world actually knows. The detail this entire video is going to spend the next several minutes explaining in careful, documented detail. Egypt depends on the Nile for roughly 90% of its total water supply, an almost total dependence unmatched by nearly any other major nation on Earth. And Egypt itself supplies almost none of that water. More than 85% of the water that actually reaches Egyptian territory originates hundreds of miles upstream, falling as seasonal rain in the highlands of Ethiopia, a country that for the better part of 100 years had almost no formal legal say whatsoever in how that water was measured, allocated, or shared among the nations depending on it. So the question this video is actually going to answer is simple enough to state directly, and it should genuinely surprise you once you understand the full mechanism behind it. How did the country that gives the Nile almost none of its own water end up controlling that same river for an entire century? And what actually happens now that the country where the water genuinely begins has finally built a physical switch of its own after 100 years of being locked out of the conversation entirely? Because water scarcity, the way most people casually picture it in their minds, is usually a story about clouds, drought, and shifting climate patterns. That's not really this specific story, or at least not primarily. This is a story about geography and power, about who happens to sit at the physical top of a river and who sits at the bottom of it, and what happens, in very concrete and documented terms, when the country at the top finally stops quietly accepting the arrangement history simply handed it a century ago without its consent. Let's start with the river. Everyone watching this video probably already thinks they understand reasonably well. For most of the last century, if you wanted to understand who genuinely controlled the Nile, the answer seemed obvious, almost too obvious to seriously question by anyone who hadn't taken the time to look closely at the actual underlying geography involved rather than simply the historical narrative surrounding it. Egypt did, unambiguously and without meaningful challenge from any quarter. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus is credited with calling Egypt the gift of the Nile, and the phrase has stuck for over 2,000 years, repeated in textbooks and travel guides and documentaries, for genuinely good reason. Without this single river, the overwhelming majority of Egyptian territory would be uninhabitable desert, indistinguishable from the vast, empty stretches of the Sahara surrounding it on every side. With it, Egypt built one of the longest continuously inhabited civilizations on Earth, stretching back more than 5,000 years, its entire agricultural and political life organized around the predictable rhythm of the river's annual flood. Today, Egypt still depends on the Nile for roughly 90% of its water needs, supporting a population of over 100 million people, packed almost entirely along a narrow green ribbon of irrigated land tracing the river's path north to the Mediterranean Sea. That dependence is exactly what makes Egypt's actual legal relationship to the river so strange, once you look closely enough to understand it. In May 1929, Egypt and Great Britain, with Britain acting on behalf of its East African colonies at the time, including Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, and what would eventually become Tanzania, none of which had any independent voice of their own in the negotiation, signed an agreement dividing up the Nile's water through an exchange of formal diplomatic notes conducted largely between British and Egyptian officials in Cairo and London. The terms were remarkably one-sided in Egypt's favor. Egypt received the overwhelming majority of the river's measured annual flow under that agreement, roughly 48 billion cubic meters out of an estimated total flow of 84 billion cubic meters, leaving a considerably smaller share to be divided among every other nation the river actually passed through. And critically, beyond the water allocation itself, Egypt received something else that would matter far more in the following century: an effective veto over any construction project anywhere upstream that might reduce the volume of water eventually reaching Egyptian territory, along with the explicit right to inspect and monitor river conditions throughout the entire upstream basin. 3 decades later, in November 1959, Egypt and a newly independent Sudan signed a follow-up treaty, dividing the river's water between just the two of them and effectively reinforcing the same colonial-era framework, allocating Egypt the largest single share of any nation along the entire Nile. Notice, carefully and deliberately, who actually wasn't in the room at all for either of those two foundational agreements governing this river's water. Ethiopia, home to the Ethiopian highlands, where the overwhelming majority of the Nile's actual physical water originates in the first place, was never a party to either treaty in any capacity whatsoever. Not in 1929, not in 1959. A country with no meaningful upstream infrastructure at the time, and with limited practical ability to enforce its own claims to a river beginning entirely inside its own sovereign borders, simply had its water divided up between two other nations, with the full legal backing of a colonial power that had never once asked its opinion on the matter. Ethiopia, worth noting explicitly, was never itself formally colonized in the way most of its neighbors were, having successfully repelled an Italian invasion attempt in the late 19th century, which makes its total exclusion from these specific water-sharing agreements even more striking. An independent nation, watching two other governments divide up a river that began on its own mountainsides without ever being consulted. Here's the detail worth sitting with, the one this entire video eventually turns on, and the one almost nobody outside a fairly narrow circle of hydrologists and regional specialists fully appreciates. The Nile, as most people picture it on a map, is really two entirely separate rivers merging into one before reaching Egypt at all. The White Nile begins near Lake Victoria, deep in East Africa, and winds slowly north through several nations, contributing a comparatively modest and fairly steady share of the river's total volume year-round. The Blue Nile, by contrast, begins in the Ethiopian highlands, fed by dramatic seasonal monsoon rains that hammer that particular stretch of mountainous terrain for months at a time, and it contributes over 85% of the Nile's total flow during the rainy season, meaning the overwhelming majority of the actual water that eventually reaches Egyptian farms, faucets, and fields began its journey not in Egypt at all, but on a mountainside a continent away. Egypt, the nation whose entire 5,000-year civilization is built on this single river, generates almost none of the water flowing through it. Ethiopia, a country with comparatively little formal legal claim to the river under the treaties that governed it for the better part of a century, generates most of the water that makes the entire downstream system function at all. For most of the 20th century, that mismatch between geography and legal control simply didn't matter much in day-to-day practice, because Ethiopia lacked the capital, the engineering capacity, and, for long stretches spanning multiple decades, the basic domestic political stability to actually build anything significant on its own stretch of the Blue Nile, regardless of what any treaty did or didn't formally grant it on paper. Ethiopia spent much of the mid to late 20th century consumed by internal conflict, a prolonged civil war, and a devastating famine in the 1980s that drew international attention and aid, none of which left room for the kind of sustained, decades-long infrastructure investment a project of this scale would eventually require. Egypt's control of the Nile, in other words, was never really a function of geography at all. It was a function of treaties, and behind those treaties, of colonial-era power and diplomatic leverage, and, at several distinct points across the 20th century, explicit Egyptian statements framing any significant upstream dam project as a direct threat justifying a military response. That arrangement held, largely unchallenged and rarely even tested, for the better part of 100 years, simply because no upstream nation had ever possessed the practical means to test it seriously. And then, in the early 2000s, that started to change, not through negotiation, but through a decision made entirely inside Ethiopia's own borders. Evidência 1. Etiópia começa a construir, sozinha. On April 2, 2011, in the immediate aftermath of a period of significant political change across the broader region, Ethiopia broke ground on a hydroelectric project unlike anything previously attempted anywhere along the entire Nile River system. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, built directly across the Blue Nile inside Ethiopian territory, in the country's remote northwest, not far from its border with Sudan. The initial construction contract alone was valued at roughly $4.8 billion, an almost unthinkable sum for a country whose per capita income at the time ranked among the very lowest in the world, with the dam's total eventual cost exceeding $5 billion by the time construction finally finished, more than a decade later than initially projected in the original timeline, delayed by financing gaps, engineering challenges, and the sheer scale of the undertaking itself. Here's what made this specific project genuinely different from anything that had come before it anywhere along this river's long, contested history. And it's the exact detail that made Egyptian officials immediately, visibly anxious the moment construction actually began in earnest. Ethiopia financed the vast majority of this project domestically, almost entirely from its own internal resources, through government bonds actively marketed to its own citizens, and according to multiple independent reports on the dam's financing, direct contributions deducted from public employees' salaries as part of a sustained national fundraising campaign. Egypt had spent decades successfully discouraging international lenders, foreign governments, and major development banks from financing any major Ethiopian dam project on the Nile, using its considerable diplomatic weight in exactly the way it had used that weight for most of the preceding century, to make such financing politically costly and diplomatically awkward for anyone who seriously considered it. This time, that long-standing strategy simply didn't work because Ethiopia, for the first time, wasn't actually asking anyone else for the money at all. Egypt's objections to the dam were immediate, remarkably consistent across changes in government, and, to be genuinely clear about both sides of this dispute rather than picking one, entirely understandable from Egypt's own strategic position. A population of over 100 million Egyptians depends on the Nile for the overwhelming majority of their water, in a country where rainfall outside the Nile Valley itself is negligible to non-existent across most of the calendar year. Any significant disruption to that flow, even a temporary one during a filling or drought period, represents a genuine and serious risk to Egyptian agriculture, drinking water access, and basic long-term economic stability. Egyptian officials repeatedly described the dam, in various forms across multiple successive administrations spanning more than a decade, as an existential threat to the nation's water security, language strong enough that it was occasionally interpreted internationally as raising the possibility of military action, though no such action was ever actually taken. That framing wasn't simply propaganda designed for domestic consumption. It reflected a genuine material vulnerability that any government representing 100 million people, almost entirely dependent on a single river, would reasonably take seriously, regardless of which political party happened to be in power at the time. Ethiopia's position, equally worth stating plainly and taking seriously on its own terms, was that it retained the sovereign right to develop natural resources originating entirely within its own territory, particularly for a purpose as fundamental as generating electricity for a population where, at the time construction began, the large majority of citizens still lacked reliable access to electricity at all, a genuine barrier to basic development, healthcare, and education across the country. Ethiopian officials consistently framed the dam not as any kind of threat directed at Egypt, but as a legitimate, overdue development project addressing one of the country's single most urgent domestic needs, comparable in scale and ambition to major infrastructure projects other developing nations have pursued without facing comparable international objection. Both of these framings, Egypt's genuine anxiety over water security and Ethiopia's genuine claim to sovereign development, can be entirely true at the same time, and understanding this dispute honestly requires holding both of them in mind simultaneously throughout the rest of this video, rather than treating one side as simply correct and dismissing the other as simply wrong or acting in bad faith. Evidência 2. O enchimento do reservatório, sem acordo tripartite. For nearly a decade following that initial groundbreaking ceremony, Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia negotiated, on and off and with varying degrees of seriousness, across multiple separate diplomatic tracks and shifting mediating parties, including the African Union, the United States, and the World Bank at various points, over the exact terms under which the dam's massive reservoir would actually be filled with Nile water over time. Negotiations that repeatedly stalled over fundamental, seemingly irreconcilable disagreements about filling timelines, drought contingency measures for years when rainfall ran low, and, perhaps most critically of all, what binding enforcement mechanism, if any, would actually govern the dam's day-to-day operation once a genuine dispute inevitably arose between the three governments. In July 2020, with those negotiations still fundamentally unresolved, after nearly a decade of talks, Ethiopia began filling the reservoir anyway, unilaterally, in the first of what would become 5 separate filling phases stretched across the following 4 years: 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, and finally, October 2024. It's worth being genuinely precise about the legal status of that specific decision, because the exact framing used here matters considerably for understanding the dispute correctly rather than taking sides prematurely. Ethiopia filled its reservoir without a signed, binding tripartite agreement in place with either Egypt or Sudan. That much is a documented, undisputed fact, verifiable through the public record of the negotiations themselves. Whether that specific action actually violated international water law is a considerably more contested question, one multiple governments and international legal scholars continue to actively dispute rather than treat as a settled legal conclusion one way or the other. Egypt and Sudan have argued through their own legal representatives that the unilateral filling violated established international legal principles against causing significant harm to downstream states sharing the same river system. Ethiopia has consistently maintained, through its own legal counsel, that the dam poses no meaningful harm to downstream water security over the long term, and that filling a reservoir located entirely inside its own sovereign territory required no other nation's explicit permission under prevailing international law. Both positions have been argued at considerable length by trained legal experts representing each government in various international forums over the following years, and this specific dispute has not been definitively resolved by any binding international court or arbitration body as of this recording. By the numbers, once fully filled, the reservoir behind the dam holds a total capacity of roughly 74 billion cubic meters of water, an amount worth pausing on for scale, nearly equivalent to the entire average annual flow of the Nile itself as measured downstream in Egypt, meaning the reservoir, at full capacity, could theoretically hold back close to a full year's worth of water. Egypt has historically counted on receiving. Just under 60 billion cubic meters of that total is considered actively usable for ongoing power generation rather than simply held in permanent reserve. On July 3, 2025, Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed publicly declared the dam complete, a moment of considerable domestic pride and national celebration after 14 full years of construction spanning multiple changes in Ethiopia's own domestic political leadership, including a period of serious internal conflict that many observers had assumed would delay or even derail the project entirely. On September 9, 2025, Ethiopia formally inaugurated the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, now with an installed capacity of 5,150 megawatts, the single largest hydroelectric facility anywhere on the entire African continent, capable of roughly doubling the country's total electricity generation capacity overnight. In a ceremony that took place amid open, publicly and repeatedly acknowledged diplomatic tension with both Egypt and Sudan, neither of whom sent senior government officials to attend the celebration. Evidência 3. Este não é caso isolado, é padrão. If this story stopped at the Nile, it would already be significant. But the pattern it represents shows up again and again on rivers most people have never thought to connect to this one. Consider the Mekong River, which originates on the Tibetan Plateau and flows out of China through Myanmar, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam, before finally reaching the sea thousands of kilometers later. China has constructed 11 major dams along the upper stretch of the river, known inside China as the Lancong, collectively capable of storing a volume of water roughly equivalent to the entire Chesapeake Bay, one of the largest estuaries in the world. In 2020, a study conducted by the research organization Stimson Center using satellite altimetry data and partly funded by the United States government concluded that during a severe regional drought throughout 2019, water levels immediately below China's dam network remained artificially high, while downstream nations simultaneously experienced record low water levels. Evidence, the study's authors argued, that upstream dams had actively restricted water flow precisely at the moment downstream countries needed that water most. China has firmly disputed this specific conclusion. The Chinese government maintains its dams help regulate and stabilize seasonal flow rather than restrict it, and has not accepted the study's characterization of deliberate withholding, framing its position instead as responsible upstream water management. What's genuinely not disputed by either side, regardless of how they characterize the 2019 episode itself, is the underlying structural reality. Roughly 60 million people across the lower Mekong Basin depend on that river for food, drinking water, and their basic livelihood, and every single one of them now depends, in practice, on decisions made far upstream, inside a country whose interests don't always align neatly with theirs. And this pattern extends even further than rivers most people have actually heard of at all. According to the United Nations Water Agency, roughly 60% of the world's total freshwater flow crosses at least one international border before ever reaching the people who ultimately depend on it, spanning 153 separate countries, 286 distinct river and lake basins, and nearly 600 shared underground aquifers that don't respect any political boundary drawn on a map. Even the Indus River, shared between India and Pakistan, and governed since 1960 by a treaty mediated by the World Bank, one of the longest surviving water-sharing agreements between two historically hostile nuclear-armed neighbors, illustrates the same underlying dynamic in a different form. A treaty India moved to place in abeyance in 2025 in the aftermath of a specific security incident. This video won't detail further, since that particular dispute remains genuinely active and unresolved as of this recording, and analyzing it in depth would go well beyond this video's specific focus on the Nile. The Indus case is worth mentioning here for exactly one narrow reason, without wading further into its own separate complexities. It confirms, once again, from a completely different river on a completely different continent, that water access, wherever a river happens to cross a border, has become a lever. Nations are increasingly willing to use, adjust, or withhold entirely the moment their broader relationship with a neighboring country shifts. Here is the turn this entire video has been building toward from its opening seconds. For 100 years, Egypt controlled the Nile, completely and unquestionably. But Egypt's control was never actually rooted in geography at all, however much it may have felt that way to anyone living inside that arrangement. It was rooted entirely in treaties negotiated under colonial conditions, in decades of accumulated diplomatic leverage, and in the credible, repeatedly stated threat of military force against any upstream nation that dared try building, without Cairo's explicit permission first. Go back to the assumption most people carry into this story without even fully realizing they're carrying it, that whoever has the longest, deepest historical relationship with a river, whoever built the oldest and most celebrated civilization along its banks, must logically be the nation that actually controls it. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is the clearest possible demonstration, playing out in real time over the past decade and a half, of exactly why that intuitive assumption is wrong. History doesn't control a river's physical flow. Geography does, in the end, every single time. And for the first time in roughly 100 years, the nation sitting at the actual physical source of the Nile's water, not the nation holding the oldest historical or cultural claim to it, now holds the concrete physical tools to meaningfully influence how and when and how much of that water continues flowing downstream. That's the mechanism worth naming as precisely as possible, because it's genuinely the thesis underneath everything this video has walked through so far. A dam sitting at a river's source doesn't actually have to cut off water permanently, or even very often, in order to function as real usable leverage. It simply has to exist, credibly and visibly, as something that could restrict flow if its owner ever chose to do so, during a severe drought, during an unrelated diplomatic dispute over some entirely different issue, during any future moment when the upstream nation's own interests and the downstream nation's basic needs stop aligning as neatly as they once did. That's not a hypothetical threat invented for dramatic effect in this video. It's the exact same structural anxiety Egyptian officials have stated outright, in plain and direct language, repeatedly, across multiple different administrations spanning more than a decade, ever since construction on the dam first began back in 2011. And we know with genuine confidence that this isn't some unique quirk specific to Nile geography alone, because the exact same underlying structural mechanism is playing out right now, in real time, on the Mekong River as well, thousands of miles away and involving an entirely different set of nations. China's 11 dams on the upper river don't need to permanently starve downstream nations of water in order to function as genuine leverage. They simply need to exist, credibly capable of restricting flow when Beijing chooses to, for downstream nations to be forced to factor that possibility into every single decision they make about their own water security, their own long-term agricultural planning, and their own broader diplomatic posture toward a considerably more powerful neighbor. Whoever controls the physical source of a major river controls a switch of genuine consequence, entirely independent of whether or not they ever actually choose to flip it in practice. Whoever depends heavily on that same source, however historically significant, however ancient and internationally celebrated their own civilization built around that river might be, has to live permanently with the uncomfortable, unavoidable possibility that switch could move against their own interests at some unpredictable future point. Neither side can fully anticipate or reliably control in advance. This is precisely where that earlier statistic, roughly 60% of the world's freshwater flow crossing at least one international border, stops being a dry, abstract number and starts functioning as a genuinely significant strategic fact with real consequences for hundreds of millions of people. 153 separate countries share river basins and underground aquifers with at least one neighboring state, according to the United Nations' own water agency. That means, for the majority of the world's population living along any major river system, the actual physical security of their water supply depends, at least in meaningful part, on decisions made inside a different country entirely, one whose government they didn't elect, whose domestic priorities they have no vote in shaping, and whose interests may not, in any given decade, continue to align neatly with their own. None of this means violent conflict over water is somehow inevitable, and it would be genuinely irresponsible to end this particular section of the video by claiming otherwise without solid supporting evidence. Several respected analysts and international relations scholars have discussed water scarcity as a potential future flashpoint for interstate conflict in coming decades, particularly as climate change intensifies drought cycles across already water-stressed regions of the world, from the Horn of Africa to Central Asia to parts of the American Southwest. That's a scenario genuinely worth taking seriously, one discussed carefully and with appropriate caveats by serious credentialed people actually working in this field of study. It is not, as of this recording, a settled prediction of what will definitely happen in any specific place or time frame. And this video isn't going to treat informed speculation, however well-reasoned, as though it were already established, documented fact. What is settled, and what this video has spent the last 25 minutes demonstrating through specific, carefully documented cases rather than abstract theory, is something considerably narrower and, in its own way, considerably more useful for actually understanding the modern world. That the physical geography of where a major river begins has quietly become one of the most consequential, least discussed forms of leverage in 21st century geopolitics, regardless of which nation happened to build the older, more historically famous civilization sitting downstream from it. So let's return to exactly where this video started its argument, because at this point, every single piece of it should land quite differently than it did back in the opening minute, before you understood the full mechanism behind it. For 100 years, the country that gave the Nile almost none of its own water still controlled the entire river system anyway, and controlled it completely, through treaties, accumulated diplomatic leverage, and colonial-era legal frameworks, rather than through anything resembling actual physical geography or genuine hydrological contribution. And in 2025, the country where that water genuinely begins finished building a switch entirely of its own, not by conquering anyone, not by breaking any specific, clearly established binding international law that's been definitively ruled against it by any competent court, but simply by finishing construction of a dam inside its own sovereign borders, financed almost entirely with its own citizens' money, on a river that begins its journey on its own mountainsides, long before it ever crosses into anyone else's territory. It's worth being fully honest in closing this video about exactly what remains unresolved here, because this particular story doesn't end with a tidy, satisfying conclusion, the way some documentaries prefer to wrap things up. As of this recording, Egypt and Ethiopia have not reached anything resembling a comprehensive binding agreement governing how the dam actually operates during future droughts, how any future disputes over water levels get resolved through an agreed mechanism, or what practical recourse either nation genuinely has if the other believes its core interests are being harmed. In fact, tension between the two countries has continued to escalate rather than gradually settle in the months following the dam's formal inauguration, with Ethiopia publicly announcing plans for several additional dams further along the same broader river system, and senior Egyptian officials, including the country's president, signaling in increasingly direct public language that they would respond firmly and decisively to any further upstream construction they view as an additional, compounding threat to national water security. Outside governments, including at points the United States, have periodically floated their own offers to help mediate this specific dispute, with mixed and so far inconclusive results. Outside powers have periodically offered to step in and mediate this underlying dispute over the years, sometimes with genuine diplomatic effort behind the offer, and sometimes as little more than a symbolic gesture. None of those efforts, as of this recording, has yet produced anything resembling a lasting, comprehensive settlement between the parties involved, one that all three governments would consider genuinely binding and durable. This is a live, actively unfolding dispute, not a closed historical chapter with a neat ending already written, and anyone watching this video, months or years after it was originally recorded, should genuinely take the time to look up the current state of negotiations for themselves, rather than simply assuming that anything described in this video has since been resolved, one way or the other, in the intervening time. What has been settled permanently and irreversibly is the underlying structure of leverage on this specific river system. The dam exists, fully built and operational. It isn't going away, regardless of whatever diplomatic outcome eventually emerges from continued negotiation. And every single future negotiation between Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia will now take place with Ethiopia holding a physical, functioning asset at the river's actual source that simply didn't exist a single generation ago, a structural fact no future treaty can quietly undo. That's the actual, durable outcome of this entire story. The one piece of it that isn't subject to further negotiation, regardless of how the broader diplomatic relationship between these two nations continues evolving from this point forward. And there's a lesson embedded in this story that extends well beyond the Nile specifically, well beyond any single river system in isolation. As climate change intensifies drought cycles across multiple continents simultaneously, and as populations continue growing steadily along nearly every major river system on Earth, straining supplies that were already stretched thin decades ago, the nations sitting at the actual physical source of shared water are going to keep discovering one river basin at a time, the exact same leverage Ethiopia just demonstrated so visibly and so publicly to the entire world. Water in the 21st century is quietly becoming exactly what oil became throughout the 20th, a resource whose true value depends enormously on physical geography rather than historical prestige, and whose practical control increasingly determines which nations hold quiet, structural power over their neighbors, and which nations are instead forced to simply hope, year after year, that the priorities of whatever government sits upstream continue aligning reasonably well with their own. This is the first video in a series this channel is calling Blue Gold, deliberately tracing exactly this same underlying pattern across the world's major shared river systems, one basin at a time. Because the Nile is nowhere near the only place this exact structural dynamic is currently unfolding, whether or not it happens to be making international headlines at this specific moment. The Mekong is next in this particular series, And after that, the Tigris and Euphrates, where Turkey's own massive, genuinely decades-long dam-building program has already begun testing the same fundamental upstream leverage over Iraq and Syria that Ethiopia has just tested, quite visibly and quite publicly, over Egypt. Once you've actually seen this pattern clearly demonstrated on a single river, complete with specific treaties, specific dates, and specific consequences, you'll likely start noticing some version of the same underlying structure on essentially every map you happen to look at afterward, wherever a river happens to cross a national border. There's a broader shift in how geopolitical power actually gets exercised, worth naming directly as this particular video closes out. For most of the 20th century, the clearest, most legible form of geopolitical leverage involved standing armies, defended borders, and conventional military strength measured in tanks, aircraft carriers, and troop counts. What the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam demonstrates, quietly but genuinely unmistakably, once you've traced the full history behind it, is a considerably older and in some ways far more patient form of leverage quietly reasserting itself on the world stage. Not simply who happens to have the largest army at any given moment, but who happens to physically sit at the very beginning of something every nation downstream genuinely cannot live without, regardless of how that downstream nation's own military or economy happens to compare. If you want to keep following the map of how modern power actually works, the quiet switches sitting at the physical source of rivers most people never think to trace back far enough to understand fully. This is exactly what this channel does, every single time. I'll see you in the next one.